as Jonathan said, I'm Isaac Murchie. I'm going to talk about logging in Appium. This at one point had fancy scrolling logs through, so you could see the kind of dump of information that comes from the logs from Appium. Oh, there it goes. That's not supposed to happen. I work for Sauce Labs. We're out there. You can talk with us. If you need to get in contact with me, you can install my npm package and then run it. All my contact information's there. So, why do we log it all? All this information goes by, goes streaming by as your session's happening. And a lot of it just seems random. It seems like it's nonsense. And basically the point of my talk today is to make it a little bit less random and a little bit less intimidating, so you can dig in and try to solve the problems on your own, or at least try to get in the direction of a solution for a problem. The first reason that the logs exist is because errors happen. Error's going to err. So some of these things are known. There are known solutions to problems, but we can't just have you read all of the documentation and implement all of the things that we say, or you'd go nuts and never actually get to any automation. So we might get a big, long bit of logs for a particular command. This is getting the location on an iOS simulator, or setting the geolocation on the iOS simulator. And it looks intimidating. It's got this stack trace in the middle of it, and a bunch of nonsense. But it also has this now bolded line to tell you exactly what you need to do to mitigate this problem. In any case where we know how to do it and it's simple, we can do that, or point you to a bit of documentation if it's longer. Like if you have a Chrome driver Chrome problem, then we can point you to a 5-page long page in the documentation to explain the problem and how to fix it easily. It's something that doesn't need to escalate beyond reading the logs. The second reason is that worse things happen. We have errors that are easily fixed. We have errors that perhaps are not. So looks basically the same, but it's much less human readable. There's no information here that, if you're not familiar with the code base, would make any sense. So, but without having this, somebody who does know the code base would have nowhere to go with your issue, with your problem. So we wouldn't be able to just on its own look at the problem that, in this case, getting the source for the page doesn't work. We have this logs, we get the exact error, cannot read property to lowercase of undefined. I just made the error happen. It doesn't actually happen. But and a particular line, so line 12 of source.js. So if you feel like diving into the code, we know that it's, Daniel has pointed out the size of the code base, and sometimes that's intimidating on its own. But if you feel like jumping in, you have an exact line to check out. Or if you are handing it off to somebody else, they have an exact line. They have an exact place to go in order to try to solve your problem. Without it, it would be a needle in a haystack. But then a lot of problems, as you know, if you just change a desired capability, the problem goes away, or you get a new problem, or this sort of thing. And a lot of that has to do with context. So this is both logging and kind of a introduction to what Appium is doing when it starts a session. But the session creation is setting up the context of your automation. So stepping through it a little bit quickly, we don't have a lot of time, but will help with kind of understanding the flow, as well as making it more apparent of what is being logged. So you can go in there and look at it and realize that it's actually informative. It's actually not as intimidating as the giant flow of things looks like. I ran a simple session creation for iOS and ended up with 136 lines of logs, which seems excessive, but they are necessary. We're going to be a little bit quick and just think of the sections. This is iOS and simulator specific, but the things that Appium does in a session startup are always the same, whether it's Android, iOS, real device, simulator, emulator. They do the same things. We need to, get the right device. We need to make the device how we want it, this sort of thing. So with iOS Startup and with every single command, you start with this HTTP line and an arrow pointing to the right. This is the sign of a command coming in. It's a request coming in from the client. If it doesn't happen, then something happened between the client and the server, and that command Appium had no way of executing because it never got. And then you always get whatever the client sent. So all of the arguments that were sent by the client to the server. So you can see if there was some miscommunication, if the client did something weird, wonky with your capabilities in this case, or with an argument in general, and fix the problem from there. And then we get kind of the basis for your automation. So not only the desired capabilities, the things that were sent in when you requested the session, but also any default capabilities that were set at the command line. So at this point, if you look at this set of lines, you know this is exactly what Appium is going to try to set up in order for you to run your automation. And it will change depending on what you send in, but it will also change if you happen to accidentally have default capabilities where you're always setting the command timeout to 1 second. You will see it here and be like, oh, shoot, I shouldn't have been doing that. That was weird. Before that, we have an indication of what slice of the code base is there. So if you gave an error, say you gave one of those errors that we got, I showed at the beginning, where we had a line in a file and that sort of thing. If we didn't know what version of Appium you were using and what version of the driver you were using, then there's nothing to do, because everything will change. The line number only corresponds to a particular line in a particular version. Anytime we add a line, then you change the line numbers and things like that. So having the version number is very important. I've seen this. And in both Android and iOS, how your automation works will depend on the tools that are installed on your machine. So knowing the sorts of, in this case, Xcode and the tools involved with Xcode is important. In Android, knowing the version of the SDK, knowing what the ADB is running, these sorts of things is necessary because different versions have different problems. Every version has its own set of limitations and problems. So the logs are there, in this case, in order to provide information about the exact environment in which Appium is running. And this it may seem trivial, but it also kind of is necessary in order to try to reproduce and solve problems. You may also, it's oftentimes you see you accidentally, we had it at SOS just a few days ago, somebody accidentally upgraded the version of Xcode on a machine, and then suddenly all the tests were failing because we were trying to run a system that wouldn't run with that newer version of Xcode on it. So immediately looking at the logs, I could see, oh, we think we have this version of Xcode, and what we actually have is a different version, and then we can roll it back and fix things. We determine a device. In every test, we had to determine a device, and we need to go through the app, making sure that the app actually exists, it's present. These sorts of errors happen all the time, that you have a path wrong, or you have the app has a different name in that build or something. And also the bundle ID. So we're getting the information about what we're going to run. And then, again, Android and iOS both need to make the device itself what you want. So if you send in a particular setting, you send in a particular preference for the device. So you want to make sure that it gets a particular keyboard or something like that. Or then we need to set that sort of thing up, going through a bunch of steps. And you can see exactly, you'll be like, my test is not working because we can't set the location, for instance. And you can look through the steps of setting preferences and realize, oh, it's not actually setting the ability to set the location or something of that nature. And then this will indicate that something is either wrong with how how you're trying to start the test or start the session, or something is wrong with Appium itself. And that'll point you in different directions for fixing things. And finally here, this is ridiculously short for an iOS simulator to start up, but we get that the thing actually started. I would more expect that to be double at this point in time. App being installed, we need to install the app unless it's a web test. And then there was a question earlier for another person about WebDriver agent. And this, I said there were 136 lines in the logs. You'll see that most of them are this nonsense. So in iOS, WebDriver agent needs to be started. The most important line for that is this bolded one. So this is the actual command that we use to start the XUI test framework on a device. So you can always run what is in quotes there, Xcode build for testing, et cetera, and see that if Xcode is capable of running a test on that device without Appium. So there's a lot of moving parts in Appium, as you see. So one of the big ones is Xcode, and that often fails. So knowing the exact command that Appium is actually running allows you to look at whether Xcode is failing or whether Appium is failing in some way along the way. Just a bit of explanation, since this does come up and it will go on and on and on and on and on. This is just polling to make sure that WebDriver agent is started. The only way we know it starts, for some reason, Xcode doesn't tell you that it started. The only way we can tell it started is by poking it until it says something back to us. And this is the pokes, basically. So we will eventually get a response, which means that WebDriver agent is running. This means that the device is capable of being automated, basically. And in Android, it's the same thing. We push a different server on. You've seen it already today, the Appium UI Automator 2 server gets pushed onto the device, started, and we poll until it's running. And that is what actually does the automation on a device. WebDriver agent in iOS and UI Automator 2 server in Android. And then we send commands to it. So this is a response to the command of status, which is basically just, are you alive? And the answer eventually, hopefully, is yes. Excuse me. We then start a session. Android and iOS are exactly the same. The session gets started in Appium server, but then also on the device, we have another session that are linked together. And then we get a notice, hopefully, that everything is successfully started. And the very end of this, as the end of every single command, is another HTTP line, this time with an arrow pointing to the left. And this is saying that there's a response. We're sending that response back. So just to wrap up a little bit, anytime you're looking at a problem that's happened, even if you're looking at just, you have the specifics of a command, the command in the logs is gated by 2 lines that are both prefixed with this HTTP in a square bracket. The line coming in, the request coming in with the method, in this case post, it can be get or it can be delete for ending a session, and then the URL to that command. So you can find that. If you're finding source, you can go through and you'll find /wd/hub/source. You know that's the command. And everything up until the next time there's an HTTP line with an arrow pointing to the left is the logs for that particular command. So then we get a return with the same method, the same URL, and a little bit of information in this case about the status of that command. So in this case, there's a 200, which is just an HTTP return code. So 200 could be 404 if you can't find the root, or it could be 500 if something went wrong. And then the useful one for debugging things is the next, which is the time that it took to operate on that command. So in this case, it took about 93 seconds to start the session. So it's relatively slow, but you can see sometimes that things will take longer than expected, shorter than expected, these sorts of things. Based on this number, this is basically the arbiter of how long it took. You can make the logs print a timestamp at the beginning, but then you have to go through and be like subtracting things and about out of time. The last number, I don't know why you'd ever want to know it, but it is the content size of the response. So it can be huge. If you send like a screenshot, you'll be getting the content size of basically the picture turned into text, which is sent back on the wire. So I know that was fast and a lot of information, and looking at logs is always relatively boring, to be perfectly honest. But looking at logs is necessary to kind of get a sense of what is happening in Appium and to debug any problem on your own, which hopefully everybody's doing when they have a problem. They're starting to debug it on their own without trying to get other people to help. But just knowing the steps that are going on, it becomes clear why, in this case, why this took 98 seconds, 99 seconds to create the session. There's a lot going on in there. So I'm out of time, but hopefully you'll start being less intimidated by the logs and start to see that they are necessary and actually quite interesting if you dig in. Okay, thank you.